Hey folks, originally I want to bring you something a little bit different today. Originally my intention was to benchmark my very first gaming PC that I built in 2004 and see how it held up. Yes, this garish Half-Life 2 inspired hatchet job was my pride and joy 13 years ago, sporting an AMD Athlon 64 CPU, 1GB of DDR memory and the legendary 9800 Pro. Now I'm talking about ATI's crown and jewel at a time where Nvidia were pumping out monstrosities like the FX 5800. Back in the day, this graphics card tore through games like Half-Life 2 and Counter-Strike, almost hitting that magical 60 FPS. And even today it was looking not too bad in the behemoth that was Crysis until something along the lines of this happened. The motherboard, after 13 years of service, decided enough was enough and gave up the ghost. Now at this point there was two options: scour online and pay over the odds to see if I can find a working 754 motherboard, or give it that upgrade that I'd always planned to do about a decade ago, and take that a stage further by installing a modern GPU. To me, option 2 seemed the better bet, and after a quick hunt on eBay I managed to pick up a fully working Intel Core 2 quad motherboard with a nice Q9400 for around about £15. The aging PSU that came with the case in 2004 was the next to go, and it was replaced by a Corsair 450W unit, again bought on eBay and barely used, for £25. The 4GB of DDR2 RAM I've installed in this machine and the hard drive were both pillaged from the old HP workstation I used for my £50 PC challenge. But the price of DDR2 RAM and mechanical hard drives on eBay are pretty much negligible and they can be had for a few pounds each. So what was the total cost of this component? Well, roughly about £45. So this only leaves the GPU. Now we could go old school here, stick in a GTX 8800 and build a cracking 2006 era PC, but in the spirit of creating something that could actually be used today, I decided to take the advice strewn across most of my GTX 1050Ti videos. Hundreds of comments tell me that the point of the 1050Ti is that it turns an old or used PC into a viable gaming rig. So let's see what happens. The spec is similar to our Q6600 £50 challenge build, with many of the pitfalls of building with a pre-built removed. So let's see if this platform is the saving grace of what surely must be one of the most divisive new GPUs currently on sale. So the final specs: it's an Intel Core 2 Quad Q9400 with a very mild overclock sitting at 2.8 GHz. Coupled with 4GB of DDR2 RAM and using a Gigabyte motherboard. The GPU is a Gigabyte GTX 1050Ti, and to be perfectly honest with you, there's no point in overclocking the GPU because the CPU is already struggling to feed the GPU its standard clocks. But anyway, let's crack on with the benchmarks and see how this, in total £175 build, gets on. First up, we've got Half-Life 2 Episode 2, with everything turned up as high as it can go. And what do we get? Well, the machine never really dips below 110 FPS. And any bottlenecking we can see, it's got to be in the program rather than the hardware. When Half-Life 2 came out in 2004, the average gamer would have been using a single core CPU, so even this old Q9400 has no trouble here. The game itself is as addictive as ever, and getting back into that hazmat suit is always a great experience for me. Fallout 4 now, and it provides a bit more of a challenge, being a much newer and more demanding title. Still, on the high preset with some of the more advanced options turned off, this PC returns a respectable 46 FPS on average, with average minimums around about 33. Now on to GTA 5. Now this is a game that scales fairly nicely on lesser hardware, and it's the same story as Fallout 4. We see averages hovering around the mid 40s, with the average minimums just staying above that 30 FPS threshold. Battlefield 1 now, and it's also perfectly playable on this machine, although it is obvious that the Core 2 Quad is starting to struggle to keep that GTX 1050Ti fed, with the CPU usage pegged at 100% and the GTX card sitting around about 75. Still, this was enough for an average frame rate of 41 FPS, while the average minimums hover just below the 30 FPS mark. For playability's sake with this title, you're probably going to want to turn down a few of the higher settings to bring the average minimum frame rate up past 30 FPS. Now, a game that I'm absolutely addicted to at the moment is Rise of the Tomb Raider, so trying it out on this machine on the medium preset, we've seen an average frame rate of about 48 FPS, and the average minimums, they still keep above that 30 FPS threshold. In some of the less demanded areas, you could in theory turn the settings up a little bit to maintain lows above 30 FPS, but for the most part, I'd recommend you just compromise a little, sit back and enjoy the adventure, and set those settings at a lower setting. Thankfully, Rise of the Tomb Raider is one of those games that just looks absolutely amazing regardless of the settings. And finally, speaking of games that look amazing regardless of settings, we've got Crysis 3. And it's always a nice test, and I was surprised at how the setup coped with it. To give it its best chance, I dropped the resolution in this test down to 900p, which allowed for a great mix of eye candy while maintaining the average frame rate around about 60 FPS. Now, this is a slightly older title than Battlefield 1 or Rise of the Tomb Raider, and it shows because it's less CPU intensive. Regardless of this though, the fact that we can play the game at 60 FPS on average most of the time and never really experience any dips below the 35 to 40 FPS mark show that this old setup can quite happily game in more demanding titles. So what can we take away from this little build? Well, let's put something into perspective first off. This system is typical of a 10-year-old PC. A decade. In PC terms, it might as well be a pharaoh's tomb, but by coupling it with that GTX 1050TI, it means you can not only breathe some life back into it, but you also create a useful system for everyday tasks as well as light gaming. Now, there's no doubt that the GTX 1050TI here is being bottlenecked by that Core 2 Quad CPU. Like I've mentioned, the CPU usage is mostly pegged at 100% during gaming, but I'm sure you already knew that would be the case before you even clicked on this video. But for £175, or even £200 if you needed to source a case and a couple of fans, what it does mean that even on a budget you can build such a nice little gaming rig that allows you to run newer games, looking better than the latest generation of consoles in a lot of cases, and at an overall lower price. I said in my £50 PC challenge that this was a good way to get into PC gaming, but something like this, it would be much more apt than that. But if the £50 PC was a good way to get into PC gaming, this £175 build, it's a great way to get into it. Older components are becoming harder to find though, but if you bide your time and have patience, a cheap and capable gaming PC could be just a few auction clicks away. Now, before I end this video, I just wanted to say another huge thank you to all the viewers who have been supporting this channel by subscribing and leaving feedback. Likewise, let me know what you think of this cheap and cheerful remastering of my first gaming PC, and if you think this PC is where the 1050Ti belongs. Anyway folks, as always, take care, and I'll see you both in the comment section below and in the next video.